Hi, Peter from Mango, and welcome to Compliance Conversations. For today's conversation, we've brought our partners together to hear what their insights into policies, what they should have, how to get the best value out of them, and determine whether they are being followed. Question 2, what should a policy contain? And maybe even more important, what should a policy not contain?
That's an excellent question. So I think first off, any policy needs to be appropriate to the organization. We have a thing here that we do called the McDonald's or the Kentucky Fried Chicken test. Is if I can take somebody's policy and replace their company name with McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken, and the policy still reads and makes sense, then the policy is not appropriate in terms of its content. It means it's not company specific. So that's one of the things that we do. So it should be appropriate to the company. If you're a construction company, if you're a manufacturing company or a brewery, it should contain some specific information with regards to the scope of activities for your business. So in other words, if you're a brewery and you say you're a brewery and I put McDonald's in your brewery name, then the policy is not going to make sense, which means it fails the McDonald's test. So anyway, that's some of the things that a policy shouldn't have in it. What it should have in it is a grouping of commitments from the organization. So one, that it's specific to the organization and speaks of the scope, the nature and scale of the organization, and it should be appropriate to that. It also should have a number of commitments in it. So from a health and safety perspective, we should commit to the elimination of hazards, reduction of risks, prevention of injury and ill health. So high level values as such that the organization ascribes to. So that's what should be in there. And then ultimately management commit to that, and workers then have the opportunity to hold management accountable to the commitments that they've made in the policy.
A policy should contain an overview of commitment of the company to that topic, whether it's an information security policy, quality, health and safety, environmental, and so on. It's a high-level commitment on, so let's take health and safety policy, and it's a high-level commitment on zero injury or zero harm or reduction of accidents, and the commitment of the company to continuous improvement, to involvement of their employees and so on. What it shouldn't contain is the detail of how they're going to do it. Not that the detail is not important, but that's when you have company objectives and strategic objectives elsewhere, because as soon as you start putting all those details into the policy, then you end up having policies of 3, 4, 5 pages, which we can see all the time. And all of a sudden, it actually loses its impact on staying that high-level commitment of the company.
First and foremost, I think it's important to recognize what your audience is or who your audience is. I think that's really important. So if you are talking about a policy statement where it's the whole organization, it must contain the key information of what you're trying to portray. There's no point packing everything into the policy statement. So it's important to minimize the amount of words that's used in that type of document, because it's got to be clear, it's got to be concise, and it has to contain the key message of what your expectation is of the company level and the people that will read it. When it's a more detailed policy, where it's maybe referring to law and things like that, it must contain the information that's relevant so that people can either read that information or know where to go to get that information. Some of the things that's important about not including in a policy is the procedural aspect of it, the how-to aspect of it. Some companies I've seen creating, 50, 60-page policies, and effectively what they've done is they've brought in processes and procedures into a policy. So it's explaining what should be done, and then it's explaining how to do it. So a policy statement and a policy itself, a policy document itself, shouldn't go to that level.
I think the most effective policies are those that are simple and easily understood. As I mentioned, I think the object is really to communicate. So what it should contain is straightforward language dealing with the process or the activity at hand, so that it's easily disseminated, so that it's easily understood, it's easy to read. I think where policies get off track is where you start to write really too much information that doesn't really necessarily directly apply to the task, activity, business process at hand. That tends to bog down and clutter up the communication process. To me, the bottom line, policies is communication. It's just in a written form, and it's a way to make sure that everybody's expectations are aligned, the organization, all the stakeholders, and it also sets up a chance to make sure that you have a forum to effectively communicate.
Okay, so easy one first. What should it not contain? It's not this is how you do it. So it's not, shouldn't contain a whole bunch of do this, do this, do this. It's not its content. It's not an SOP or a procedure. In terms of what it should contain, certainly it should contain this is who's responsible for it. This is what the target's going to be and how we're going to get there.
Well, I'm going to start with what it shouldn't contain, and that's war and peace. I've seen some so-called policy documents that are huge. And to me, that's not just setting the top level framework. I tend to think of a policy document being a much more short, succinct document. But also, I think it's important that it should be tailored and relevant to the organisation. I think some companies, when they're setting up management systems, get this wrong because they try and start with the policy document without having understood the context of the organisation and other things that will really help them. So I think it should feed in with who they are, what they do, which in turn will help you to understand what legislation may drop out of it.
Okay, well, what we shouldn't have in a policy is the company's how brilliant we are type stuff and the marketing spiel. That's not the purpose, and it shouldn't be in there. It should contain some key short messages about high-level direction in terms of where the continuous improvement of the business is going, where we're trying to get to, but not in a marketing speak, in a business language that is short and to the point.
My experience is that really, I guess, the content of the policy is actually vital to getting something or a document that's able to be understood and monitored and reinforced within the business. I'd recommend you start with, well, determining what the technical requirements are first. As you'd probably be aware, the management system standards provide guidance on what broad terms or broad requirements must be contained within, for example, a safety policy, quality policy, environment policy. There's also regulators that provide useful guidance in that regard as well. Once you determine the minimum technical requirements, it really is important that the policy is then developed with the input of a broad group of stakeholders. So they would be representatives from various levels within the business, and they actually contribute towards developing a policy that is actually appropriate to the needs of the business, take into account those technical requirements determined earlier. Part of the things, or one of the issues I see all the time in what we do, is you have policies for a business of 20 or 30 people that has clearly come from a multinational business, and so it's largely irrelevant to that business and becomes meaningless for the people that actually have to adhere to that policy. Overly complex, overly wordy policies tend to be, in my opinion, not very effective, and importantly, they're very difficult to be understood throughout the organisation. And you've got to remember, policy is not a procedure. Policy is telling you what is required. A procedure is telling you how you may go about meeting the requirements of that policy. More effective policies are usually shorter in length, they've involved a wide group of stakeholders, and they're easily understood and enforced throughout the business.
Policies should contain information as to what the company believes in and what the company is going to do from a broad level. You don't want to get too detailed in it, otherwise it gets well too complicated and people struggle to actually follow it. It should contain an understanding of who we are. It should get an understanding accountability statements, and it should contain enough detail that someone can have a clue as to what you're doing. It shouldn't contain the detail as to we're going to fill out Form A or we're going to fill out Form B or we're going to meet every Tuesday. That is too much information for a policy that should be understood, which is purely a philosophical document as to who we are.
So policies are going to have things like visions and objectives and general targets and those sorts of things. Some of the things that I don't think should be in a policy is too much detail. I think most policies should try and limit themselves to around about a page. They're not 5-10 page procedures which go into the how-tos and outlining lots of very specific targets, those sorts of things. They're high level, aspirational type of things that we want to see happening in our workplace.
A really important tip, it should contain things that you're actually aiming to achieve as a business. I'd see a lot of broad motherhood statements that are not very well defined. So we want to be world's best practice in, and then you ask them, well, what is world's best practice? And they say, well, we don't actually know. You've got to realise you're making, whether it's to external auditors or to your stakeholders or the public, you're making a commitment. So you must go for something you're actually aiming to achieve. Make it reasonable, make it realistic, something you're actually aiming to achieve. Keep out those kind of broad motherhood statements that sound good, but not really things that you can achieve.
Thank you, partners, and hopefully to the people watching this, you got some value out of this. Of course, you can always go to our website, to the partner page at the bottom. You'll find the contact details of the people who participated. Thank you very much.